Hello everyone, today we read and comment the ninth chapter of the sixth book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, its title being Defensive Battle. The text follows. We have said in the preceding chapter that the defender, in his defensive, would make use of a battle, technically speaking, of a purely offensive character if, at the moment the enemy invades his theater of war, he marches against him and attacks him, but that he might also wait for the appearance of the enemy in his front and then pass over to the attack. In which case also the battle tactically would be again an offensive battle, although in a modified form. And lastly, that he might wait till the enemy attacked his position and then oppose him by both holding a particular spot and by offensive action with portions of his force. In all this we may imagine several different gradations and shades, deviating always more from the principle of a positive counterstroke and passing to that of the defense of a spot of ground. We cannot here enter on the subject of how far this should be carried and which is the most advantageous proportion of the two different elements of offensive and defensive as regards the winning a decisive victory, but we maintain that when such a result is desired, the offensive part of the battle should never be completely omitted, and we are convinced that all the effects of a decisive victory may and must be produced by this offensive part, just as well as in a purely tactical offensive battle. In the same manner as the field of battle is only a point in strategy, the duration of a battle is only strategically an instant of time, and in the end result, not the course of a battle, constitutes a strategic quantity. Now, if it is true that a complete victory may result from the offensive elements which lie in every defensive battle, then there would be no fundamental difference between an offensive and a defensive battle as far as regards strategic combinations. We are indeed convinced that it is so, but the thing wears a different appearance. In order to fix the subject more distinctly in the eye, to make our view clear and thereby remove the appearance now referred to, we shall sketch hastily the picture of a defensive battle such as we imagine it. The defensive waits the attack in a position. For this he has selected proper ground and turned it to the best account, that is, he has made himself well acquainted with the locality, thrown up strong entrenchments at some of the most important points, opened and leveled communications, constructed batteries, fortified villages, and looked out places where he can draw up his mass under cover, etc. Whilst the forces on both sides are consuming each other at the different points where they come into contact, the advantage of a front more or less strong, the approach to which is made difficult by one or more parallel trenches or other obstacles, or also by the influence of some strong commanding points, enables him with a small part of his force to destroy great numbers of the enemy at every stage of the defense, up to the earth of the position. The points of support which he has given his wings secure from him any sudden attack from several quarters, the covered ground which has chosen for his masses makes the enemy cautious, indeed timid, and affords the defensive the means of diminishing by partial and successful attacks the general backward movement which goes on as the combat becomes gradually concentrated within narrower limits. The defender therefore casts a contented look at the battle as it burns in a moderate blaze before him, but he does not reckon that his resistance in front can last forever. He does not think his flanks impregnable. He does not expect that the whole course of the battle will be changed by the successful charge of a few battalions or squadrons. His positions is steep for each part in the scale of gradation of the order of battle, from the division down to the battalion, has its reserve for unforeseen events and for a renewal of the fight, and at the same time an important mass, 1/5 to a quarter of the wall, is kept quite in the rear, out of the battle, so far back as to be quite out of fire, and if possible so far as to be beyond the circuitous line by which the enemy might attempt to turn either flank. With this corps he intends to cover his flanks from wider and greater turning movements, secure himself against unforeseen events, and in the latter stage of the battle, when the assailant's plan is fully developed, when the most of his troops have been brought into action, he will throw this mass on a part of the enemy's army and open at that part of the field a smaller offensive battle on his own part, using all the elements of attack, such as charges, surprise, turning movements, and by means of this pressure against the center of gravity of the battle, now only resting on a point, make the wall recoil. This is the normal idea which we have formed of a defensive battle based on the tactics of the present day. In this battle, the general turning movement made by the assailant in order to assist his attack, and at the same time with a view to make the results of victory more complete, is replied to by a partial turning movement on the part of the defensive, that is, by the turning of that part of the assailant's force used by him in the attempt to turn. This partial movement may be supposed sufficient to destroy the effect of the enemy's attempt, but it cannot lead to a like general enveloping of the assailant's army, and there will always be a distinction in the features of victory on this account, that the side fighting an offensive battle encircles the enemy's army and acts towards the center of the same, while the side fighting on the defensive acts more or less from the center to the circumference in the direction of the radii. On the field of battle itself, and in the first stages of the pursuit, the enveloping form must always be considered the most effectual. We do not mean on account of its form generally, we only mean in the event of its being carried out to such extreme as to limit very much the enemy's means of retreat during the battle. But it is just against this extreme point that the enemy's positive counter-effort is directed, and in many cases where this effort is not sufficient to obtain a victory, it will at least suffice to protect him from such an extreme as we allude to. But we must always admit that this danger, namely of having the line of retreat seriously contracted, is particularly great in defensive battles, and if it cannot be guarded against, the results in the battle itself and in the first stage of the retreat are thereby very much enhanced in favor of the enemy. But as a rule, this danger does not extend beyond the first stage of the retreat, that is, until nightfall, and the following day enveloping is at an end, and both parties are again on an equality in this respect. Certainly the defender may have lost his principal line of retreat and therefore be placed in a disadvantageous strategic situation for the future, but in most cases the turning movement itself will be at an end, because it was only planned to suit the field of battle and therefore cannot apply much further. But what will take place on the other hand if the defender is victorious? A division of the defeated force. This may facilitate the retreat at the first moment, but next day a concentration of all parts is the one thing most needful. Now, if the victory is a most decisive one, if the defender pursues with great energy, this concentration will often become impossible, and from this separation of the beaten force the worst consequences may follow, which may go on step by step to a complete rout. If Bonaparte had conquered at Leipzig, the Allied army would have been completely cut in two, which would have considerably lowered their relative strategical position. At Dresden, although Bonaparte certainly did not fight a regular defensive battle, the attack had the geometrical form of which we have been speaking, that is, from the center to the circumference. The embarrassment of the Allies in consequence of their separation is well known, an embarrassment from which they were only relieved by the victory on the Katzbach, the tidings of which caused Bonaparte to return to Dresden with the guard. This battle on the Katzbach itself is a similar example. In it, the defender at the last moment passes over the offensive and consequently operates on diverging lines. The French corps were thus wedged asunder, and several days after, as the fruits of the victory, Puthod's division fell into the hands of the Allies. The conclusion we draw from this is that if the assailant, by the concentric form which is homogeneous to him, has the means of giving expansion to his victory, on the other hand the defender also, by the divergent form which is homogeneous to the defense, acquires a means of giving greater results to his victory than would be the case by a merely parallel position and perpendicular attack, and we think that one means is at least as good as the other. If in military history we rarely find such great victories resulting from the defensive battle as from the offensive, that proves nothing against our assertion that the one is well suited to produce victory as the other, The real cause is in the different relations of the defender. The army acting on the defensive is generally the weaker of the two, not only in the amount of his forces, but also in every other respect. He either is or thinks he is not in a condition to follow up his victory with great results, and contents himself with merely fending off the danger and saving the honor of his arms. That the defender, by inferiority of force and the other circumstances, may be tied down to the degree we do not quite dispute, but there is no doubt that this, which is only the consequence of a contingent necessity, has often been assumed to be the consequence of that part which every defender has to play, and thus in an absurd manner it has become a prevalent view of the defensive that its battles should really be confined to the warding off the attacks of the enemy, and not directly to the destruction of the enemy. We hold this to be a prejudicial error, a regular substitution of the form for the thing itself, and we maintain unreservedly that in the form of war which we call defense, the victory may not be more probable, but may also attain the same magnitude and efficacy as in the attack, and that this may be the case not only in the total result of all the combats which constitute the campaign, but also in any particular battle if the necessary degree of force and energy is not wanting. So let's simply comment, because it's an interesting perspective on the defensive battle. So, von Clausewitz says, we have said in the preceding chapter that the defender in his defensive would make use of a battle, technically speaking, of a purely offensive character if at the moment the enemy invades his theater of war, he marches against him and attacks him. Right? So the guy is strategically defending overall in the theater of war, but he attacks the guy at that point also on a lesser strategical scale and from a tactical point of view. And he says, but that he may also wait for the appearance of the enemy in his front and then pass over to the attack, so that it's a full strategic defense, but eventually on the field he passes to the attack. In which case, von Clausewitz says, also the battle tactically would be again an offensive battle, in fact, although in a modified form. And lastly, that yes, because at the beginning of the battle, he would still be there, essentially waiting for the enemy, right? And lastly, von Clausewitz says that he might wait till the enemy attacked his position, and then oppose him both by holding a particular spot and by offensive action with proportions of his force. So as we've said, also in a defensive battle proper, you will try to use, however, some reserve, usually to pass through the counter-attack in a way, or with outflanking, encirclement, or a concealed party, or whatever, right? So defensive and offensive always exist from both sides, but just in different proportions. Even in the most defensive of cases, the defender will essentially pass on the offensive, not just on the counterstroke that he has to do when he has collected the enough advantage to exploit it, right, with a counterattack against the enemy, but properly during combat. And as we have seen also, there's nothing like a complete passive defense, because you're warding off a blow, and in that sense you have to somewhat engage the enemy still, at the level of the individual soldier, let's say. So, von Clausewitz says, in all this we may imagine several different gradations and shades, deviating always more from the principle of a positive counterstroke and passing into that of defense of a spot of ground, right? So we see really, the extremes of like a situation where the enemy attacks you first and you simply attack him back, right? So the full attack to literally the defense of one single spot, which can happen. Like the Schwerpunkt, as we all see, can actually even be a spot on the battlefield, right? It can be the number of the enemy, can be the morale, it can be anything in a way, and it always changes. But more of that when we'll talk about the Schwerpunkt. Then von Clausewitz says, we cannot here enter on the subject of how far this should be carried, and which is the most advantageous proportion of the two elements of offensive and defensive, as regards the winning a decisive victory, which wouldn't even make sense proper, because if you read let's say the very last phrase of the last chapter, that is fantastic, relatively to the prescriptional and descriptional nature of the Vom Kriege, but relatively to the art of war. But von Clausewitz says, we maintain that when such a result is desired, the offensive part of the battle should never be completely omitted, And we are convinced that all the effects of a decisive victory may and must be produced by this offensive part just as well as in a purely tactical offensive battle, right? That is to say, we cannot think to win a battle without passing a certain point to the offensive. Whether it's a counteroffensive or not doesn't matter, but it's still fundamentally about that. And we've seen it, because otherwise you would be a fully passive individual. That is not possible, right? You don't just you don't have that as an option, really, because even just individual will try to fight back. Then von Clausewitz says, in the same manner as the field of battle is only a point in strategy, the duration of a battle is only strategically an instant in time, and the end and result, not the course of the battle, constitutes a strategic quantity. Now, if it is true that a complete victory may result from the offensive elements which lie in every defensive battle, then there would be no fundamental difference between an offensive and a defensive battle as far as regards strategic combinations. We are indeed convinced that this is so, right? Because it's that fluid, really, that in every battle lots of things can happen, and you can't really quite, even exactly prearrange that. But the thing wears a different appearance between this kind of offensive and defensive battle in general, right? And that's what we are here for, to describe. Von Clausewitz says, in order to fix the subject more distinctly in the eye, to make our view clear and thereby remove the appearance now referred to, we shall sketch hastily the picture of a defensive battle such as we imagine it. So this is the general picture, and naturally it always varies, because this is kind of, in part, also prescriptional, in the sense that, at least for Napoleonic warfare, it's how it was done practically. But we know von Clausewitz is referring to a broader, universal value. So here it's just an approximation that he uses for the sake of, of concreteness. And he says, the defensive waits the attack in a position. For this he has selected proper ground, and turned it to the best account. That is, he has made himself well acquainted with the locality, thrown up strong entrenchments at some of the most important points, opened and leveled communications, constructed batteries, fortified villages, and looked out places where he can throw up his masses under cover, etc. So really predisposed everything that makes him better sheltered from the enemy, but also better supplied from the rear, and therefore also allowing enough maneuver while the enemy is concentrating his forces in the attack. Then von Clausewitz says, whilst the forces on both sides are consuming each other at different points where they come into contact, the advantage of a front more or less strong, the approach to which is made difficult by one or more parallel trenches on other obstacles, or also by the influence of some strong commanding points, enables him with a smaller part of his force to destroy great numbers of the enemy at every stage of the defense up to the heart of the position. The points of support which he has given his wings secure him from any sudden attack from several quarters. The covered ground which he has chosen for his masses makes the enemy cautious, indeed timid, and affords the defensive the means of diminishing by partial and successful attacks the general backward movement which goes on as the combat becomes gradually concentrated with narrower limits. The defender therefore casts a contented look at the battle as it burns in a moderate blaze before him. But he does not reckon that his resistance in front can last forever, right? So this is fascinating, because it's literally what the defender does, right? He knows that his advantage at that point will be spent, because the attacker is, as we've seen, on average on a disadvantage on that ground, and in order to win the defensive, the clash will make the attacker consuming more resources than the defender. So the defender sees his forces being worn out, but at a lower rate than the one of the enemy, lower speed. But he's still aware he can't hold forever. And at some point, the struggle there is always about, will this thing crumble or not? Will the line hold or not? So von Clausewitz says he does not think his flanks impregnable, the defender. He does not expect that the whole course of battle will be changed by the successful charge of a few battalions or squadrons, right? Because also, as we often said, the most important battle, the more balanced the odds. So consequently, the more of the entire forces at your disposal are to be spent. Like most battles are, like literally you have to throw in everything you have, and at the right moment with the right timing, the right place, right? So this is not going to be simply, I throw in a bunch of units, have in reserve, and I win the battle, right? That would be like a ridiculous advantage maybe against an enemy that launches a desperate attack hoping to break, but still it's unrealistic in many ways, because at that point it's more likely the enemy to have already surrendered in practice, because who does want to kill himself if they realistically don't have much choice in the end? Unless naturally there is, like at that point you want to take out as many enemy forces as possible, but not literally winning the battle. It's plenty of such kind of of battles actually, but because there is a strategic implication in that. But here, tactically wise, it's rare to meet with such values, just because you want to lose the battle by itself. And as we've seen, most losses during combat are during the battle are sustained after the battle, right? So it doesn't matter how hard even you can inflict to the enemy in combat, losses you can inflict to the enemy in combat, right? Those are never going to be, like, proportionally, yes, okay, they can be disproportionate sometimes, it does happen, but still, you will spend entirely yourself, and if you still lose, you will completely be annihilated at that point. So that's something you have to take carefully into consideration. So always on the defender, Von Clausewitz says, his position is deep. For each part in the scale of gradation of the order of battle from the division down to the battalion has its reserve for unforeseen events and for a renewal of the fight, which is what the defender usually has in less proportions, because he has to concentrate everything properly in the attack, hoping to win that disadvantage that the defensive usually has, as we've seen, and that therefore is more eager to spend everything like in one blow, because it's more concentrated, whereas the defender naturally has to put up with that, has to cope with that, but still he can make, let's say, he can hope that his advantage will be enough to save some troops to carry out some other kind of maneuvers, such making reserves intervening and therefore having a gradual fort in combat. At the same time, an important mass, 1/5 to a quarter of the wall, is kept quite in the rear out of the battle. This is important. This is a proportion that is valid in general, right? Not just for Clausewitz's time. So objectively, yes, from having a reserve of 1/5 of 1/4 in defense is realistically what can, let's say, balance the odds of, let's say, the defensive advantage and the attacker disadvantage. Why? Because that would level what is happening in the front line. So it would taking away these men from combat would take away, at the moment, more resources to stop the attack, and it's somewhat risky, but still we have seen that the reserves will be fresher at one point while the enemy is spent, and therefore you can employ them for outflank and for other maneuvers for which they still have forces and capacity and order, especially because if you had committed them all in one shot, you would fundamentally so you count on time there. We've seen this on the chapter on reserves and their employment, right? And the benefits that you expect from these flanking maneuvers are difficult, but at that point you can hope to use exactly by exploiting this defensive advantage to drive away part of the forces by exploiting the enemy's disadvantage is greater, let's say, than the advantage you could have had you deployed those guys in the line to withstand the attack initially. This is extremely important because some of the greatest victories in military history were literally achieved like this. Right, more on that later, especially in the condition of the defendant proper, because the defendant is more eager to do this very often than the attacker, because he is more, it's a bet, right? It's a gamble, because an outflanking maneuver, as we've seen, is dramatically difficult, so it's not easy at all to do, but still, it can be the chance at that point for a defender that is usually the weaker side, right? The defensive has, on average, the advantage on the defensive, but the defender is usually defending because it's weaker than the attacker. Actually, most of the time, I'd say virtually all times. Otherwise, he wouldn't be defending properly. He would invent something else, right? He would also use those encircling maneuvers to carry at that point to hope to gain an advantage. Doesn't matter whether the enemy at that point would be defending and have its own reserves as well, right? Because that would mean he is strong enough to do it. So this is extremely important. It's very easy to understand, actually. It's very dichotomic. So von Clausewitz says, again, at the same time, an important mass of 1/5 of a quarter of the wall is kept quite in the rear out of the battle. So far back as to be quite out of fire, so that he is probably not engaged, and if possible, so far as to be beyond the circuitous line by which the enemy may attempt to turn either flank, so that not only you can use it to actually encircle the enemy, but to, first and foremost, actually stop the enemy flanking maneuvers that can always happen, so that you have an advantage there, because the enemy outflanking you is basically detaching a unit that is cut out from the mass, and therefore is exposed, and therefore you can, by attacking your own flank, is in turn exposing your flank to possible reserves that you have deployed behind the line. So it's very important. Can really save a lot of battles like that as well. There's plenty of these. Think about Pharsalus, for example, what Caesar did with the legionary reserve against Pompeian cavalry. But anyhow, with this corps, he intends to cover his flanks from wider and greater turning movements, secure himself against always the defender, unforeseen events, and in the latter stage of the battle, when the assailant's plan is fully developed, when the most of his troops have been brought into action, he will throw this mass on a part of the enemy's army and open at that part of the field a smaller offensive battle in his own part, using all the elements of attack, such as charges, surprise, turning movements, and by means of this pressure against the center of gravity in the battle, now only resting on a point, make the wall recoil. This is the normal idea. So eventually he has to pass to this damned counterattack, because without that, as we've seen, you basically go nowhere. So von Clausewitz says, this is the normal idea which we have formed of a defensive battle based on the tactics of the present day. In this battle, the general turning movement made by the assailant in order to assist his attack, and at the time with a view to make the results of victory more complete, is replied to be a partial turning movement on the part of the defensive, that is, by the turning of that part of the assailant's force used by him in an attempt to turn. This partial movement may be supposed sufficient to destroy the effect of the enemy's attempt, but it cannot lead to a like general enveloping of the assailant's army, and there will always be a distinction in the features of a victory on this account, that the side fighting on an offensive battle encircles the enemy's army and acts towards the center of the same, while the side fighting on the defensive acts more or less from the center to the circumference in the direction of the radi. On the field of battle itself, and in the first stages of the pursuit, the enveloping form must always be considered the most effectual. We do not mean on account of its form generally, we only mean in the event of its being carried out to such an extreme as to limit very much the enemy's means of retreat during the battle. Because you have to bottle them at that point, and exploiting the fact that they are broken. But it is just against this extreme point that the enemy's positive counterfort is directed. And in many cases where this effort is not sufficient to obtain a victory, it will be at least suffice to protect him from such an extreme as we allude to. So that you can also avoid the enemy carrying out the same on you. But we must always admit that this danger, namely of having the line of retreat seriously contracted, is particularly great in defensive battles. And if it cannot be guarded against, the results in the battle itself and in the first stage of the retreat are thereby very much enhanced in the favor of the enemy. So it's alright. So, but as a rule, this danger does not extend beyond the first stage of the retreat. That is until nightfall. On the following day, enveloping is at an end, and both parties are again on an equality in this respect. So, even in the case of a most brilliant encircling maneuver, etc., what happens at night is usually the enemy reforms somewhere else, and you have to stop the pursuit. And it often happens in a way, in fact, in which the pursuit is not over. It can be a strategy literally to fight also close to the night. If you think that there is a risk in that sense, especially from the defender that, as we will see now also better, as we were already hinting at before, is usually the weaker side. So it's always, not, as we've seen, positively acting, because defense is the stronger form of war, but the one with a negative aim, leaving the initiative to the enemy. And von Clausewitz says, certainly the defender may have lost his principal line of retreat, and therefore be placed in a disadvantageous strategic situation for the future. But in most cases, the turning movement itself will be at an end, because it was only planned to suit the field of battle. Right? These massive encircling a fort, outflanking a fort, is carried out in order to win the battle. Right? That's the most important thing. You're not thinking, of course, strategy, as von Clausewitz has already told us, does inform tactics in as much as what do you actually want to achieve here. But generally speaking, the larger the battle, so the most important and the most strategically meaningful in itself, because as we repeated endlessly, there is no strategy without battles. Right? Everything is aimed at combat, right? And the larger it is, the better it is. So at that point, all these resources you have concentrated, and as we've seen, usually when this happens, it's because the enemy does the same thing and odds are the most balanced on average. You are trying to invest all your resources for a tactical outcome, right? Yes, will match with the strategical interest, because if you have concentrated the largest amount of enemy forces in front of you, you want to wipe them out, and you will achieve a massive strategic effect, not just because of the loss in itself of enemy lives, but literally because of as we've seen, the psychological impact that is devastating can, reach at that point. Also politics, maybe making the enemy surrender, whatever, all this thing that mismatches the actual losses on the field and affects psychology in a way that is very different from what actually happens on the field. Even fake news can help that in case even of a defeat. So the idea of a pursuit is naturally unspeakable, as we've seen, because that's where you actually kill more people, more enemies, and therefore you can inflict further losses. You take the trophies of war; those are the ones that actually make the big psychological impact eventually to actually determine how much the enemy lost, right? But as we've seen here, the most important in the battle, the most maximized the deployment of the troops is to the tactical outcome, to that specific field where the battle is actually fought, right? And it doesn't take into consideration too much the strategic deal, because the first point here is to win the freaking battle. You have not won yet, and this is exactly the kind of battle as the larger ones that is the less predictable and the most important, so the highest gamble, right? So you want to maximize everything to that tactical outcome, not just how far you can pursue them after. It's already a big deal if you manage to win, right? So this often helps the defender, because as you understand, if he loses, because at that point when he retreats, he is coping with an enemy that, yes, has won, but has invested all its resources, so doesn't have even so many fresh resources to pursue him. And this will bring to some kind of strategical advantage, but still, that will be something still in the wake of the magnitude of the disaster that happened here. So of course, you don't actually hope to be defeated just to make the enemy have run out of resources. No, you still hope to win, because that's still the single most important thing that will make the greatest strategic result, right? But still, von Clausewitz observes that these forces are, if the attackers the winner forces are all spent, it's more difficult to pursue the enemy, and therefore to achieve, more than much in terms of actual in the pursuit. In fact, there are very few battles that actually go like that. That is, somebody achieves like a dramatic victory with just a portion of his forces, and then has still fresh reserves on which he can't pursue, and at that point makes a massacre that never ends, right? But still, some of the greatest victories in that regard are actually carried out like that, right? And that's why they are great, because they come to complete destruction of the enemy, and therefore have not just often tactical masterpieces, because still, you have managed to win such an outstanding victory with just lesser forces than your integral ones, but you also have wiped out the hell out of the enemy, and you have achieved a strategic victory of enormous proportion. Then, for Clausewitz says, but what will take place, on the other hand, if the defender is victorious? A division of the defeated force. Well, this may facilitate the retreat at the first moment, but next day a concentration of all parts is the one thing most needful. Now, if the victory is a most decisive one, if the defender pursues with great energy, this concentration will often become impossible, and from this separation of the beaten force, the worst consequences may follow, which may go on step by step to a complete rout. Right? So, when you defend, as we repeated already, you are usually the weaker side. So, you may actually even win an astonishing victory, but still, your strategic needs at that point will be to keep your forces concentrated, because up to that point you were fundamentally on the living in the initiative on the enemy, growing kind of weaker. So what happens there is that you have spent you had less forces of the enemy in general. You were exploiting the defensive exactly for this reason. So if you manage to win, and at that point it's been difficult to you probably employed most of your forces, and you send them even out tired to pursue, that's a great risk, because you first of all you scatter your forces, they are tired, and therefore your strategic weakness at that point could be exploited by the enemy. It doesn't matter whether defeated or not, to actually counterstrike. It does happen, it often happens, especially when you actually literally break the lines to pursue. We've seen it. Think about the Battle of Montpellier that we described recently, because between the Flemish and the French. The Flemish win. They resist to cavalry to the French cavalry charge. They scatter it, but they break the line, they pursue. They don't have enough cohesion to march. The French regroup. They charge again, and they defeat the Flemish. So that is quite fascinating, because it shows you how difficult, how weak an army that is already spent really is, especially in a condition where not all the enemy forces were completely destroyed. You couldn't properly pursue them at the moment. In that case, the Flemish were just infantry, for example, whereas the French could also get out there because they were on horseback. So think about that. And von Clausewitz makes an example here, says, if Bonaparte had conquered at Leipzig, the Allied army would have been completely cut in two. Right, because they were encircling him, which would have considerably lowered their relative strategic position, because their forces were split. At Dresden, although Bonaparte certainly did not fight a regular defensive battle, the attack had the geometrical form of which we have been speaking, that is, from the center to the circumference, so spreading forces. The embarrassment of the Allies in consequence of their separation is well known, an embarrassment from which they were only relieved by the victory on the Katzbach, the tidings of which caused Bonaparte to return to Dresden with the guard, right? Because it would have been too risky to go further, and that encounter had showed how much it could be. So von Clausewitz says this battle on the Katzbach itself is a similar example. If in it the defender at the last moment passes over to the offensive, and consequently operates on the diverging lines, because he literally opens his array, and the French corps were thus wedged asunder, and several days after, as the fruits of the victory, Puthod's division fell into the hands of the Allies. Right, so it's risky. Right, the defendant there is still weak, kind of, and it's very difficult here even to, at the end of the battle, even understanding what the hell happened. So you have massive strategic decisions in your hands in the most chaotic moments, where you don't even properly know how much there is out there still in terms of enemy forces. In fact, this fact of remaining in also in control of the enemy battle, of the battlefield after victory, etc., especially in earlier times, it was a big deal, exactly because it had to show that even if you had won the first day, you still had to watch out, to be careful, because if the enemy had regrouped and it struck you back, you might have lowered the guard. It would be very, very risky. And the smaller the battle, the more often this happens, right? Whereas the greater the battle, the more the effects are the psychological effects of having such enormous forces wiped out supersedes the actual absolute loss, and therefore it's rare for the enemy to even make anything about that at the first point. So this is a very important lesson in strategy. In fact, von Clausewitz says, the conclusion we draw from this is that if the assailant, by the concentric form which is homogeneous to him, has the means of giving expansion to his victory, on the other hand, the defender also, by the divergent form which is homogeneous to defense, acquires a meaning of giving greater results to his victory than would be the case by a merely parallel position and perpendicular attack, and we think that one means is at least as good as the other. That is to say, they balance themselves out, considering the advantages of the defensive and the one of the offensive. Right? There is a kind of balancement here. That is, not surprisingly, something that, in fact, literally counterbalances in war also the actual heterogeneity, as we've seen, of the advantage, disadvantage respectively of the disadvantage of the attacker and of the offensive, and the advantage of the defensive. So that, especially in the actual consequence of the outcome of the battle, you can balance things out by remembering still, as von Clausewitz will finally say, that still the defender may have this advantage, but he's acting like that because usually he is at disadvantage overall from a strategical point of view. And in fact, von Clausewitz says, if in military history we rarely find such great victories resulting from the defensive battle as from the offensive, that proves nothing against our assertion that the one is as well suited to produce victory as the other. Right, that is to say, they will balance each other, but why is it rare to find actually great victory obtained by the defender? Because, he says, the real cause is in the very different relations of the defender. The army acting on the defensive is generally the weaker of the two, not only in the amount of his forces, but also in every other respect. He either is or thinks he is not in a condition to follow up his victory with great results, and contents himself with merely fending off the danger and saying the honor of his arms. That the defender, by inferiority of force and other circumstances, may be tied down to that degree we do not dispute, but there is no doubt that this, which is only the consequence of a contingent necessity, has often been assumed to be the consequence of that part which every defender has to play. And thus, in an absurd manner, it has become a prevalent view of the defensive that its battles should really be confined to warding off the attacks of the enemy, and not directed to the destruction of the enemy. This is very important because it shows you always that the attack has, in the Clausewitzian theory, is the preferred form of war. Like, it doesn't tell you should just, prefer attack over defense. Let's say if you're undecided, you should always calculate that, right? Because every battle is different. But in general, as we've seen even in defensive, for the ensuing counterattack at the end of counterstroke at the end of the battle, at the end of properly, when he has acquired enough, he has worn out the attack enough to gain an advantage over it, if it manages to. He's always to pass on the positive, on the attack, because it's the positive form of war. You can't properly achieve a result if you don't offend. This is crucial. So that von Clausewitz here is naturally criticizing the idea that at some point the defensive is so greater that even the stronger side, certain generals at his times thought that even if you had actually an advantage, you should still act defensively, because it's as if you had summed up, the all advantage, right? That's actually wrong, because when you give the initiative to the enemy, you basically renounce the advantage of the attack. That is, at that point, the fact that you can attack in the first place, that is, you have the greater force. You say, but you will be worn out in the attack. You will lose, as we've seen, because the attack is the weaker form of war with a positive object. Yes, but the weaker, so you are at the disadvantage on average when you attack. Yes, but by acting, you're basically getting the opportunity to take out what is literally the weaker side at that point from a strategic point of view, which you shouldn't rule out just because the battle is, has to be won tactically, right? Because, yes, as we've seen, the more resources you invest there, the more you risk, but still, it's easier to wipe out a defender let's say, if you manage to win the battle, in terms of what's going to happen strategically as a consequence, then it is to wipe out an attacker if you manage to defeat him on the field as a defender, right? Because in practice, you still, as a defender, you have less capacity. Even when you have actually defeated the enemy, you still suffer of that in part. Whereas the attacker has this punching capacity that if it's just spent in defense, is lost, right? And leaving the initiative to the enemy means you're being worn out at that point, literally without doing actually much. So everything counterbalances in here. This is a very important conclusion from Clausewitz gets too, because it shows how there is really not a in practice a necessarily a preferential way to act, right? But still, military history tells us that rarely a great victory follows from a defensive battle, right? And this is to be understood, right? Still, there are pros and cons, so that they balance each other out. But let's say it's the strategic condition that brings to these battles to be also fought less in that regard, preferentially, right? And that therefore, because the defender is the weaker side, so the attacker at that point has reason to think he's the stronger. That is the actual advantage, more than the numbers, more than the actual physical forces. It's the mindset, right? If you're the attacker, you have the positive aim, so you're going to achieve something more, because that tells you how much moral forces are dominating in warfare, right? Because it's literally the mindset that makes you think whether I make it or not, right? In fact, von Clausewitz here says something beautiful here, that is that the defender contents himself with merely fending off the danger and saving the honor of his arms. That is to say, I just want to score a tactical victory, but strategically I'm declaring by defending that I am the weaker side, that I don't have a positive purpose here, because if I step out, I'm done for, because I don't have that advantage against the opponent. This is dramatically important, right? Because there are battles that are literally fought between two armies that are actually attacking each other at the same time. And those are often actually the least bloody, because they everybody freaks out, because the attacker always is carried out with a greater caution than the defense at the moment, right? The defense has prepared a lot, as we've seen before, has entrenched, etc. So more or less already knows what it has to do. It's simpler. It's part of it why it has the tactical advantage on average. Whereas the attacker is very concerned in maintaining order, coordinating the fort, etc. So if both do the same, both attack at the same time, we'll basically, paradoxically, have in that battle less victims than if that battle had been fought between attacker and defender. And in fact, the latter form of battle is the bloodiest on average in military history, and it's also burnt altogether, because the attack, as we've seen, has to be punching, immediate, violent, with most forces altogether. So those are spent in one moment, let's say, not gradually, at least, more by the attacker, but still, the defender is stopping them actively. So, as we were saying before, it's not just a passive attitude, and therefore the bloodier they are, because literally more people are killed in interest of time. And this chapter is very, very, very fascinating, I would say. One of the most fascinating in the Vom Kriege. Von Clausewitz says that the defender by inferiority force and other circumstances may be tied down to that degree we do not dispute. That is, of course, he's clever not to take the attack. If he really is at disadvantage, there's no reason for him to pass on the offense. But he says there is no doubt that this, which is only the consequence of a contingent necessity, has often been assumed to be the consequence of that part which every defender has to play, and thus, in an absurd manner, it has become a prevalent view. Okay, we already read it, but it doesn't matter. Of the defensive, that its battles should really be confined to warding off the attacks of the enemy and not directed to the destruction of the enemy. We hold this to be a prejudicial error, a regular substitution of the form for the thing itself. That is, you prefer preferring the defensive just because it's formally the stronger form of war doesn't make sense, because it doesn't take into consideration when you have an actual advantage that that's where you should act. Because you literally have the initiative, you shouldn't waste it, right? The enemy's passive at that point. Should act, should capitalize upon it, because you can do lots of things to become stronger in the meanwhile. As we've seen, it's like when you invade an enemy country and if the enemy idles, you seize a lot of stuff, you become stronger, right? Through strategy, right? This is the beauty of it. And that increase should make you, the enemy's living the initiative, so he's losing forces, he's being worn out as well, while you're getting stronger. So there is a big deal of thing he's leaving onto you. So the fact that he's at that moment he's weak, so he cannot actually, he prefers to wait and hopefully for you to attack, because you also have to, wars do not go on by chance. There is an objective there, and distracting the enemy forces is the ultimate one. Still, it's contingent. That is to say, at some point you can't even wait for too long, right? And if you wait for too long and you miss the opportunity, your army melts away, because you're already at the disadvantage that has grown, and you have to motivate people to fight, and that ends in a way. So also that battle does not produce. So this is always the direct, the link, the thread that exists constantly between strategy and tactics, because they're always intertwined. They never leave each other in that sense. Then von Clausewitz says, and we maintain unreservedly that in the form of war, which we call defense, the victory may not only be more probable, but may also attain the same magnitude and efficacy as in the attack, and that this may be the case not to be in the total result of all the combats which constitute campaign, but also in any particular battle, if the necessary degree of force and energy is not wanting. That is to say, the defensive still has this prevalent advantage where fight comes to place in place, and this is true both for single battles and, in that sense, the sum of the tactical quantities that make eventually the strategic result on the theater of war during the campaign. So this is very important, because still it confirms what we already said. Defense is the stronger form of war. It has the advantage normally, right? But still, we have to realize that this is relative to the interaction between the direct proportion between defense and attack, and it doesn't take into consideration the single realities, in which if you have an enormous advantage as an attack, a great enough advantage in the attack, you should pass the attack, because you have the opportunity, an advantage, you can wipe out the enemy. The advantage of defense is relative, right? It means that more people will die than whether these guys were attacking you. Yes. But still, you can get the victory there and cause a strategic result that you have attained that is much greater than the losses you suffered. So you just have to surpass that disadvantage if you have enough forces, and that's where the attacker has, and therefore winning. That's the point, and that's why the defender is defending, because he feels he's weak. So he's trying to resist like that. But still, the defensive, as we've seen, can acquire the same strategic, let's say, an advantage of the attacker by acting the way it does. Right, especially passing to the counterattack, and naturally if it is strong enough to allow itself to defend, that is to say, to leave the initiative to the enemy, and that is also important as well. So it's a very complex relation. You have to understand in every case what's the deal, in a sense, and it's very difficult to do, really. But when you study a battle, normally you will see, a campaign, you will see how linear, how crystalline, how actually logical such movements are, how such decisions follow. Right? You don't have, especially the larger the forces, the less the option you have, literally. So war literally works like that. War is literally most of the times really not something you can control in a different fashion, and still everything is calculated. In fact, in the greater enterprises, but of course on the gamble, because you can't foresee what's going to happen, but on aspects that can be minoritary, because the odds are balanced, and therefore even small things, unpredictable things most of the times, can actually make the decision, because defense and offensive in practice tend to, in spite of the intrinsic, let's say, because of the tactical advantage of the defense and the strategic advantage of the attack, balance each other, right? Positivity of the attack, let's say better, and tactical strength of the defense. This is the actual definition, right? They counterbalance each other, so war will follow in a logical way along this pattern, and will be decided by things you can't quite actually predetermine, but to still oblige you basically to fight in one way or another. That's what that is what is somewhat difficult to explain sometimes. How war is to be, let's say, regarded as both, as in life in many ways. There are certain things that seem inescapable, but still things will always go differently from what you actually expected, and this is crucial in many ways. This is really probably one of the single most important aspects of the theory of the art of war, like how difficult this whole thing is based on the fact that it's actually simple, right? And that simple things are not, let's say that simple things are not easy. This is what war is about. War is much simpler than it seems at so many levels, but it's still not easy, because in order to be handled requires certain capacities that lay not in a positivistic calculus, but literally in how you can actually cope with that situation from a moral point of view. And this is always the tension that exists between the offensive and the defensive, and this is crucial, right? So great lessons in strategic, lessons in strategy, let's say. And here we stop for now. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.